Hello, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 14 of the Midwest Gaming Classic Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garris, Panel Director of the Midwest Gaming Classic. This podcast episode is My Life in Games with Ed Fries. Ed Fries covers the history of the game business, from the beginning up until the present, and mixes in his own involvement at various points, including when he led the team to launch the original Xbox gaming console. Find out what Ed was doing back in 2017, including improving diversity in the game business, video games as works of art, and the importance of documenting the story of the business. And you know what? Enough of me talking. Why don't we get to the podcast?
Ed Fries, who is perhaps the most influential man on the launch of the original Microsoft Xbox, joined us to discuss his life in games, which starts long before the Microsoft Xbox was announced and continues to this day.
In the beginning, there was darkness upon the void. And then, in 1962, Steve the Slug Russell said, "Let there be light." And he created a sun and stars and gravity. And he put two ships in orbit around that sun, locked in an endless struggle for survival. And he called it Space War. And it was good. The first good video game. I was born a couple years later. That's my older brother Bob and my twin sister Karen and me in the crib. I'm the wiggly one on the left. I always had trouble sitting still. And you know, for the first few years of my life, there were no video games. But we had a few other things. We had science fiction, fantasy. There were a few TV shows back then, even back then. There was even a reality TV show going on around that time that was pretty exciting. But I had to wait till 1971 for the first arcade video game to come out. A game called Computer Space, built by two guys, Ted Dabney and Nolan Bushnell, under a name Syzygy Engineering. A year later, Magnavox Odyssey, first home game console. I didn't have either of those, but both my parents are engineers, and sometimes they'd bring stuff home from work. My dad was working at Boeing, and he would bring home these. These were programmable calculators, and so that was one of the first things I got to play on. Hopefully that's not a bad sign. My sound is going away. So yeah, you can see this lunar lander you could play on that machine. I wrote a little blackjack for it. Some of the first programming that I got to do. Later we built a hex keypad 6800 machine. But this is actually where I learned to program in assembly language. This is called Bell Labs Cardiac. It's a cardboard computer. You can look this up afterwards if you haven't seen one before. There should be one in the museum, but there isn't. Yeah, you can learn everything you need to know about assembly language just on this little cardboard computer. And there's even people who still sell these today. They have new old stock versions of these, so you can buy one and build it at home and just go ahead and learn how to program. But I had to wait till 1977 for the first personal computers to come out. Apple II, PET, Commodore PET, TRS-80. We had Apple IIs at school. And by then my mom had gone back to school. She was a chemical engineer, but she went back to college and got a master's in computer science. I have a pretty cool mom, and I'll talk a little about her later. But anyway, so she went to work at a company called DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation, which maybe some people know. And so she would bring home one of these. This is a printing terminal. And a printing terminal is, it's kind of like a printer with a keyboard and a modem. Lets you dial into a mainframe, and then you type, whatever you type gets printed, and then the computer types back to you. And so that's great for text adventures, for example. Played, yeah, you know, the original Zorg, which was called Dungeon back then. A game called The Original Adventure, which is different. Anyway, so that was some early gaming for me. But, arcades continued to march along as well. This game was done in 1976 by a couple guys, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, before they started Apple Computer Corporation. So, by 1977, this game came out, and so again we see Space War. We saw Space War in 1962, then we saw Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney try to copy it and kind of fail with Computer Space. Then here we see it again in 1977. When this game came out, it was the best-selling arcade game in 1977. They decided not to call it Space War, they called it Space Wars because something else happened in the summer of 1977. Anyone know what that was? Star Wars is correct, yes. So they put a little S on the end so they could just ride along with that. And the march of time goes on. This game comes out a year later. By 1980, I was in high school. I grew up in Bellevue, Washington, which is right next to Redmond, Washington. And Redmond is kind of famous for a couple things. It's famous for the home of Microsoft, which I'll get to later. But it's also where Nintendo's North American Distribution Center was. And so they actually put video games in our high school, which was kind of crazy. That's where most of my lunch money went when I was a kid. I was a very skinny kid, I think, because I skipped lunch a lot. But these are a couple machines we had there. We had Donkey Kong and Scramble. And I could talk more about Scramble later. We had a lot of fun playing that game. But in the computer lab in high school, we had Apple IIs. And so here's a game on the Apple II, maybe the first one. I'll ask the audience. Can anyone name this game? Famous Apple II RPG. No, nobody's gonna yell. Nobody's gonna guess. Yeah, go ahead. I can't hear you. Not Ultima. It's a good guess though. Ultima was around the same time. This is a game called Wizardry. Yeah.
I heard somebody say it.
Somebody probably said it. Yeah, they just got to be more confident. Yell it out so I can hear it. It's hard for me to hear up here. I just hear the bar. So I wanted an Apple II, but my dad bought me one of these instead. He got one Christmas, I should say Santa got me this. It showed up. Atari 800. I was really fortunate. I didn't get the 400. I didn't have to deal with a membrane keyboard. I was, maybe I wouldn't be a programmer today if I got the 400. But the 800 was, at first I'm disappointed. Oh, I wanted an Apple II like school. But then the more I got into this machine, the more I found out how great this machine is. In fact, there's a really good book that just came out called Breakout. It's about the Atari personal computer system, and it's fantastic. But anyway, any Atari 800 fans here in the audience? A couple. Okay, so you guys have no problem naming this big game for the Atari 800.
Star Raiders.
Star Raiders, thank you very much. Fantastic game, launched with the system, and was really, really great. But not my favorite game on the Atari 800. My favorite game is one of my favorite games of all time, this game. Mule. If you've never played this game is famous among people in the game industry. We love this game. People have tried to remake it many times and no one can figure out how to do it. It was created by a guy named Dan Bunton, later became Danny Bunton, and just a fantastic, weird, 4-player economic simulation, which is a great, great party game. Get 4 friends together, three other friends, and I don't know, so much fun. I started to program on the Atari first in BASIC, like a lot of people back, in my era. Pretty much how you learn how to write a game is by typing in games in BASIC out of magazines. And, you'd make mistakes and then you have to fix them and you learn how games work just by doing that. And then at some point you have to learn assembly language if you want your game to really work. And the first game that I made in assembly language was Space War. So there's Space War again. I made my version of Space War. I sent it off to Atari Program Exchange, which was a way you could publish games through Atari back then, and they rejected it. And I remember it as being just like this crushing moment that I get this rejection letter back. And I found that letter a couple years ago when I was moving some boxes, and I read the letter, and it's nothing like I remember as a kid. I read it, it's like, oh, we really like your game, and if you fix these 3 things, we'll publish it. It's like, what? It's like, it's not how I remembered it at all. But anyway, so then I was a kid, I'm in high school, I'm working at a pizza place, playing Galaxian at night after my shift is over. saving up money to buy games and writing games in my spare time. And so the next game I wrote was a Frogger clone that I called Froggy. And what happened was kind of weird. A company in California saw that game. It says by Eddie Freeze, and they wanted to publish it, and they didn't know they had to find me. So somehow, you got to imagine in 1982 or 81, I think in that case, how do you find Eddie Freeze? I mean, it's a weird name, but still. All there were phone books. There was no internet. There was no. Anyway, somehow they tracked this game back to me. And it spread from me. I gave it to some friends. They started uploading it to bulletin boards. It went from bulletin board to bulletin board. So somehow it kind of spread around the country. And then they had to track me down. They find me working in the pizza place and offer me a job working in the game business. I'm like, yeah, I'll do that. No advance, 5% royalty. It's a deal. Sign that contract. So I made 3 games for them. From 1982 through 1984, and they look like this. First they made me change Froggy because it was pretty much an exact clone of Frogger to this thing. They wanted it to have a medieval theme, so we called it Princess and Frog, and then they gave me they would give me a 1-page sort of drawing of what they wanted me to make as a game, and then I would make it. So this was kind of their Dig Dug clone called Anteater. That was my next game. These Romux cartridges are pretty collectible now. They sell for about $100, so keep an eye out for these. You can find. I'll even sign it for you and find one. That was my 3rd game, Sea Chase. That was done. By then I'm in college. I'm in a little school in New Mexico working on my computer science degree. But by 1984 it was game over. It was game over. Well, do people here know what happened in 1984 in the game business? This is what happened in the game business. If you look at the red line, and I stuck a little arrow there pointing to it, the red line shows what happened to the consumer video game business. It peaks around $9 billion in 1982, and it goes down to about $0 billion by 1984. I mean, it really crashed fast and hard, and everybody went out of business. Romux definitely went out of business, and so that was my side job at college. So now I didn't have a way to make money to pay for school and beer and stuff. So that was a problem. I had to get a real job. I talked the people in the computer science department into giving me a job running one of their computers, and so I got to run one of these. This is a VAX 750. It's a VAX mini computer that runs a 4.2 BSD Berkeley Unix. Anyway. But games go wherever you go. That's what I found. Everywhere I go, everywhere I can go, there are games. And this machine had this game in particular, which is very famous. And who can call it? You're going to tell me? Yeah. Rogue is correct. Very good. This is the original Rogue. You hear about all these games now that are roguelikes. They're alike this. This is the game, and it is an awesome game still. I recommend you find an emulated version of Rogue. There's a Win Rogue, for example, that you can play, and play the original. It's still better than almost all roguelikes. So anyway, I'm working there at college, finishing my computer science degree, and I get a summer internship job at a nearby local company called Microsoft. And it's a small company then. And they have me just working on this tutorial system, and they liked the job that I did that summer, and so they offered me a full-time job when I graduated in 1986. So left college, graduated in '86 with my computer science degree, and went to work for Microsoft. And I immediately got put on to a huge battle that was going on. I was the 7th programmer to join the team that was making the first version of Excel for Windows. And so 7 of us built that first Excel for Windows, and it was awesome and really fun, and we worked really late. And but I'm a gamer, I'm a gamer, so when I'm not at work writing code on spreadsheets, I'm at home, playing the latest games. And it was a great time to be a gamer, BattleTech, Crescent Hawk's Inception came out. Jordan Weissman's now a good friend of mine. He lives in the area, and he's working on a new turn-based MechWarrior. I hope that they did a big Kickstarter on it. Looking forward to that. 1989, this game came out. Anybody know this game? Populous, very good. Peter Molyneux, a game that made Peter Molyneux famous. Chris Roberts, Wing Commander. 1990. Sid Meier's Civilization, obviously, which is really a copy of a game called Empire that had been around for years on the mini computers and mainframes, but still awesome. So, you know, after I worked on Excels for 5 years. The team grew from 7 people to 50 people. I went from being the youngest person on the team to being the lead programmer. And then my boss went over to work on Word, and he immediately got in a fight with the lead programmer over there, and he quit. And so my boss is like, hey, come over, work on Word. So I'm like, sure, I can work on Word. So I go over, and now I'm in another big battle. You know, on Excel we had fought Lotus 123. Now over on Word we're fighting WordPerfect. And I spent another 5 years doing another Office product, doing multiple versions of Word. But of course, I'm a gamer at home, at night. What am I doing? I'm playing the latest games. And again, it was a great time to be a gamer, you know. This game came out. Can anybody say this game? I think I heard, I'm being picky about the name. I need to hear the whole name. I think I heard it. Dune 2 is correct, yes. Dune 2, and this was the first PC real-time strategy game. Came out in 1992. This game came out, Alone in the Dark. You may not know this game. This was done by a French company, and it was the first survival horror game. In fact, a few years later, you'll see I'm in Japan a few years later, and I'm meeting with Capcom for the first time. And I meet these guys, they're like, oh, look at this game we're building. We call it Biohazard. And they show me this game, and I meet the 2 guys working on it, and they show this thing to me, and I'm like, this is just an Alone in the Dark clone. You know, and they're like, yes, Alone in the Dark. You know? It's like, okay. And for people who don't know, Biohazard is Resident Evil here in the US. So anyway, it came from that game. First, I would say modern first-person shooter. Can anyone get the name of this right?
Wolfenstein, Castle Wolfenstein.
Okay, I heard it in different pieces. Yes, Castle Wolfenstein 3D. Yeah, that's very good. So anyway, like I said, another 5 years had gone by. I worked on a bunch more versions of Word, made this guy a bunch of money, you know. And I was to the point in my career where the next step up for me would be to run a business, okay? And so, you know, a couple things about that. First of all, I really only love 2 things in the world. I love programming and I love playing games, you know? And so I wasn't playing games at work, certainly, but I was still programming when I was working on Word about half-time. I could manage the team half-time and I could work on Word half-time. And so I knew when I became, you know, ran a business, I had to give up programming, you know? And so I'm like, well, what if I ran the game business? You know, that would be awesome, because then I would be like trading one thing I love for something else I love. And the guys, Microsoft had a pretty small game business back then, about 50 people, maybe a little bit more, doing Flight Simulator and not too much else, but it was a profitable business. And so I went to my bosses and I said, hey, I found this great job for me, I'm gonna go run the game business, they want me to come take the job, it's all cool. And they basically flipped out. They were very upset. Multiple vice presidents called me in, chewed me out. They told me I was committing career suicide. They told me, why would you leave office, one of the most important parts of this company, to go work on something no one cares about? I love that phrase. I just, every day I think of that phrase, it puts a smile on my face. So anyway, so I ignored them, you know, I said, no, this is what I really want to do. They rolled their eyes, they said, fine, it's your career, throw it away if you want, you know, go run the games business. And there I was. I found myself in charge of this game business that no one cared about, which was awesome because nobody really cared what I did. And I had Flight Simulator bringing money in, and I could do whatever I wanted. I mean, what would you do if you were in that position? Exactly, Age of Empires. Wouldn't you run all around the world and find the very best game developers, all the people whose games you'd been playing for, you know, a decade or more, and try to team up with them and try to make more games? I mean, that's what I did. It was awesome. Over that 8 years, we grew from about 50 people to 1,200. I went up to being a vice president of the company, and we launched the Xbox, and it was super fun, super fun. And by the end, people at Microsoft actually cared about the game business, which sucked, honestly, because I was so used to running my own show, and it was so great, and then all of a sudden, people were like trying to tell me what to do, and I didn't like it, so I left. Yeah, in 2004, I quit. I was starting a family. I had one son. I had a second one on the way. Didn't really need to be there anymore, and so I left. And I just started doing pretty much what I do today, which is working as a board member and an advisor to a mix of different companies and nonprofits. And so I'm going to talk some about that. And a lot of them are game related, but not all of them. So these are some other companies that I was involved with. I also helped some friends start a company called Airtight Games, and we put out a few games. But I tell you, if you're going to pick a year to quit your job, 2004 is an awesome year for one reason. You know, this game, I knew the guys at Blizzard very well. I had actually tried to acquire Blizzard twice during my career. Once I got outbid by a timeshare camping company called Sendin, and then a few years later I got outbid by a French water utility called Vivendi. But anyway, so I knew these guys really well. They put me in the beta, and then so I played the beta, and then just dove into World of Warcraft, and it was an awesome time of my life, carrying babies in one hand and playing World of Warcraft with the other. I didn't drop one. It's good. I love that game so much. I started a little company called Fingerprints that's still around today, where we 3D print World of Warcraft characters. And if you have a World of Warcraft character you want to have turned into a statue, we make them custom printed in color. So anyway, that's kind of the stuff that I've been doing. But I want to talk a little more about what was happening in the game business in the 2000s during this time, because it was really a critical time for freedom of expression in the game business, and I don't want people to forget about what happened then. And really, it comes down to these two characters. You know, the guy on the left, Jack Thompson, he was a lawyer in Florida, and the guy on the right, Leland Yee, was a California state senator. And they decided that video games are evil and they should be banned any way they could, basically. And they went all around the country to state legislatures and tried to get laws passed to ban video games. And they had some very good early success. In fact, they had a case that came here in the Midwest up in front of a federal judge. And after the federal judge had never played a video game, these guys provided him with a videotape of some games like Postal and a few others. He viewed the videotape, and having seen a videotape of 4 video games, ruled that all video games are evil, basically, and do not deserve First Amendment rights, First Amendment protection. So that was a federal judge. It was pretty high up. Fortunately, in the game business, we have a group called the ESA. They're sort of the lobbying arm of the video game business out of Washington, D.C. And they basically went from state to state to battle these cases. In the case of Washington State, I got to be the one to testify against the law that was passed there. Again, these guys came in, they write a law, it goes through both houses of our state legislature and is signed into law by the governor over a very short amount of time. And basically what the Washington state law said was video games couldn't be sold to minors if they showed any violence against authority figures. So you could have a police show on TV, but we couldn't have a policeman in a video game, for example. So the ESA got an immediate stay on that, and then we had to have a case and get deposed and all that. And fortunately, we won the case in Washington. The ESA battled those cases from state to state to state, and finally it went to the Supreme Court. And in actually a really close ruling, 5-4, the Supreme Court ruled that video games deserve the same First Amendment protection as TV, movies, everything else. So it shows how important it is to have the right people in the Supreme Court, and fortunately that law is on the books now, and so we don't have these problems anymore. And just to tell you how the story ends, Jack Thompson was disbarred as a lawyer, and Leland Yee, March of last year, was sent to prison for corruption. So he was running guns or something, I'm not sure, but anyway, so all's well that ends well in the video game business. 2007, this device came out. Of course, it's when it first came out, everybody said you can't play games on that. It doesn't have any buttons, and now mobile games are a huge part of our diet of video games. If you look, mobile games are have grown to be the second largest business in the video game business, and even that's maybe giving console gaming a little too much credit, because a lot of the console number comes from hardware sales, not from software sales. So anyway, of course, now we've got virtual reality. Whatever sort of is going on in the game business, I'm usually involved with some companies along the way. These are 4 VR companies that I work with, either as an advisor or as a board member, doing all kinds of fun stuff. Axon VR in particular is interesting. They're building a haptic suit. So right now they just have a glove, but you stick your hand in this glove and put on VR headset, and you can pick up a spider and you set it on your hand and you can feel it walking around on your hand. Pick up an egg and you set it on your hand and it cracks open. A little baby dragon appears and then it breathes fire on your fingers and you can feel the heat. So it does hot, cold, and touch. Anyway, the future's weird. We'll see. But really, with the time that I have left, I want to talk about kind of 3 big things that I'm involved with, that I care about today. One is diversity in the video game business. I've served as a board member of the IGDA, as a treasurer of the IGDA, which is the International Game Developers Association, and now I work as a treasurer of the IGDA Foundation. And I don't do that because I'm some kind of social justice warrior. I really do it because of my mom. My mom is a big influence to me, and I got to see her fight discrimination all her career in her various jobs, and so I just think it's really important, and I think people don't understand how bad the situation is, particularly in computer science, and I think this graph really brings it home to me. What this graph shows is basically over the last 40 years the percentage of women getting degrees in various fields. And if you can look at just about any field, science, medicine, etc., and the graph approaches 50%, okay? Computer science is the one outlier on that chart, and the number of women getting computer science degrees peaked in 1985 around 35%, and it's half of that today, 17%. So it's half of where it was, when I was graduating from college, which is terrible. There's a bunch of schools trying to fix this. I just started a program at my old college, New Mexico Tech, to try to fix it, but it's a serious problem. There aren't enough women working in the game business. We need more women to create products that work for everyone, that everyone feels comfortable with and cares about. So the IGDA runs programs like this with funding from Intel and Microsoft, where we bring women and minority game developers from all around the world and bring them to game conferences and make connections for them and try to both get them involved in the game industry and keep them in the game industry. So anyway, that's one thing that I do day to day that I really like. Thank you. No gamer gators out there are going to shoot me or something. The second thing for me is really retro, and I want to talk about retro. And for me, it really started, I was giving a talk in Philadelphia in 2009, and somebody came up to me, and I had mentioned that I had worked on the Atari 800, and they said, well, have you read this book? It's called Racing the Beam. How many people here know about this book? Quite a few. Okay, that's good. That's more than usual. It's a book about the Atari 2600. It's a great little book, and I read it, and being a programmer, it really made me want to go back and write a game for this machine. And it's a totally masochistic thing to do, because this machine is horrible. I mean, I never knew how good I had it on the 800 until I worked on this machine. It has 2 monochrome sprites, 8-bit monochrome sprites. It has 128 bytes of RAM, okay? 128 bytes of RAM is almost nothing. It has a 40 pixel low-res graphics mode in the background that you can't even write 40 pixels across. The part on the left is mirrored on the right. Anyway, it's just everything that could possibly be hard about a machine, which was, as a programmer, as a sick programmer, it's just what made it cool for me. So I'm like, oh, I wonder if I could draw just like a little picture of the Master Chief. So I opened Paint and I drew a little picture of the Master Chief in Paint, and then I put him on the screen. You know, I used, there's actually some great development tools, a great assembler, debugger called Stella Emulator. And so I made my little Master Chief, and then I'm like, okay, maybe I can make him move. So I made it so the joystick moved him around, and then I'm like, okay, maybe I can make him shoot. So then I had him shooting. Okay, I got to give him some enemies. You know, I put a few enemies in, and that was just, you know, that was just doing it for fun, just to see what it was like to work on this machine. And I go off to Game Developers Conference, and I just happened to run into some guys who are retro guys, like Mike Micah and Chris Charla, and they're standing there actually with Todd Fry, who did Pac-Man on the 2600. I just run into these guys out of the blue, and they're like, oh, well, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, you know, I was playing around with this Halo thing on the 2600, and they're like, what? You're doing Halo on the Atari 2600? Well, I'm like, no, I'm not really doing it. I'm just like this little demo kind of thing I was doing. They're like, dude, you gotta do it. And I'm like, what? And I'm like, no. And they're like, no, you gotta finish the game. You gotta make that game, you know? And so I'm like, all right, okay, all right. So I did. So I made the game Halo 2600, and you know, if you haven't seen it, it looks like this. There's the title screen, and there's the little Master Chief, and he runs around. You got to find the gun. That's a hard part for a lot of people. And you know, there's some little grunts. The grunts run away when you shoot at them, so it has little elements of Halo in it. The explosions are code, just to save space, you know, so you're just seeing a picture of code there when it explodes. And you basically fight your way through 64 different rooms, and then there's a big boss encounter at the end, and if you beat the boss encounter, which is hard, by the way, this game is hard, then you unlock legendary mode, so it's good. So anyway, I made that game. I released it at the Classic Gaming Expo in Las Vegas that year, 2010, and I thought, you know, okay, that was fun. I did that. They asked me to give a keynote speech at a game conference called MIGS, Montreal International Game Summit, and so I did this speech about that. And this guy there named Chris Melisinos, he was putting together an art exhibit for the Smithsonian American Art Museum. I'm just explaining this to you because it's like weird how serendipity works. You know, you like. Guys should just make stuff, because when you make stuff, good things happen. But anyway, you know, so I made the game, I give this speech, Chris hears it, then he's putting together this art exhibit for the Smithsonian American Art Museum, first exhibit there ever for video games, and he says, can I put your game in the exhibit as an example of homebrew? And I'm like, sure, put it in there, you know, so it's in a little cabinet, there's hundreds of games in there, you know, and the show, by the way, is hugely successful. Probably the most successful show they've ever had at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And then it goes on tour. It toured all around the country. It just stopped touring last year. But anyway, at the end of the show, when the show was leaving the Smithsonian, the curator decided to add 2 games to the permanent collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum as works of art. And so he picked Flower by that game company, which is awesome and cool, and he picked my game, which is very strange. he liked that it was, I don't know, it was like some retro commentary on the future or something. I don't know. I can't explain it. But you know, when they exhibited it again in this other art exhibit. You know, they put some like art speak like plaque on it explaining why it's art. I don't know. But anyway, but because of that, I got to go and give a talk as one of the artists working at the Smithsonian, and then they asked me. Then they asked me to join what's called the Board of Commissioners of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So now I'm on the Board of Commissioners of the American Art Museum, and I go out there twice a year and help review and approve new art for the Smithsonian. So crazy story. You know, I hope to use that position to bring more video games into the museum. I just put a deal together for them, between them and Intel. If you search for Intel and Smithsonian American Art Museum, where they came in and they 3D scanned a whole bunch of objects and they made a virtual walkthrough of part of the museum for virtual reality. So anyway, so I'll be out there in just a couple weeks at the Smithsonian. So that's fun. And then the last thing I want to talk about, and I see Marty in the back. Marty's been a big influence on me, is the guy who got me out to this conference. Is really this idea that the history of the video game business is going away. And if we don't save it, it's going to be gone. And if you look back at the early history of television, movies, a lot of the early material has just been lost because people didn't care, they didn't preserve it, and by the time they cared, it was too late. And so, that brings me to some work that Marty knows that I do, but, first we'll start with a little quiz. What was the first arcade video game? Computer Space. See, I like to ask that question, and often, nobody will remember, even though I said it at the very first thing in my talk. So this is like a test for me. I guess it's cruel, but anyway. So I bought one of these machines, broken, off eBay. I'm a programmer. I'm not an electrical engineer. I wrote a story about fixing it. Last night I did a kind of a more casual talk about that kind of work, but that I won't repeat here. But anyway, you can go to my blog, which is edfries.wordpress.com, and you can read about my efforts to try to bring back to life some of these really early machines. And that's where Marty in particular has been hugely helpful to me. So after I did that, I started to get interested in this question, which is, what is the first color video game? Color arcade video game. And surprisingly, nobody was really sure what the answer to that was. And basically the story goes like this. After they did Computer Space, Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney started Atari. I'm very nervous to tell this story because I have the world expert back there who's going to correct if I get any word wrong. But, and so they did Pong, and that was way more successful than they expected. Then they went off and they did this game called Space Race, which you could argue was the first racing game, although it's not car racing. And I'm going to leave out the Pong clones that are in here, like Rebound and Pong Doubles and stuff like that. But the next really significant game that they did after Space Race was this game called Gotcha. And Gotcha is sort of infamous for a few reasons. Well, it was the first maze game, so you could say this was the start of games like Pac-Man. But also it was the first kind of controversial game. You can see the flyer on the left is a little bit racy to begin with. Anyway, I'll talk more about that in a minute. But the thing is, I don't know, I guess I don't have the slide here, but basically, here's the deal. There's a guy called the Golden Age Arcade Historian, and he writes these great stories about everything from the beginning of the 70s up through kind of the 80s in the arcade business. And I had been reading an article of his. Oh, by the way, those games that I showed, I had been fixing them along the way. So but after I did Computer Space, I got a Pong, but I couldn't get a whole Pong, so I just got the printed circuit board, and I fixed that. And then I got a Space Race printed circuit board, and then I fixed that. And then I went to got a Gotcha printed circuit board, and this guy was just putting lots of Bronze Age, these early arcade boards up at that time. It turns out I was super lucky that just right at the time that I was interested in it, all these boards were going up online, and the first batch of boards he puts up were all super cheap, and I could just go buy it now, buy it now, buy it now, buy it now, buy it now. And then he puts up another batch and he doesn't put a buy it now price because he's not an idiot, And in the third batch of those, he puts up this board. And this board, it's probably impossible for you guys to see on the screen, but written in felt tip pen on the top of that board, it says Color Gotcha. And I had just been reading this article that there may have been a color version of Gotcha. And if there was a color version of Gotcha, it would be the first color arcade game. Well, you search for Color Gotcha online and you find nothing. I mean, almost nothing. Some people call it Gotcha Color, some people call it Color Gotcha, but there's no images, there's no pictures of this game in existence at all, or there were none until I did this work. And so I got in a fight with one other person in the world who knew what it was on eBay, and I won, and bought this board for not that cheap. And brought it back to life. And so I went through, and if you go to my blog, you can read this whole story about what it took to try to recreate these things. They always have a bunch of bad chips, and you have to track down which chips are bad and figure out how to replace them without wrecking it. And I had to figure out how to hook this up to a monitor. And in the end, I was able to put this picture up on the internet, and which is the first image, almost. I thought it was the first image of the first color arcade game. And after I can't remember if I have this slide or not. So I got two versions of the presentation. After I put this up, or actually while I was working on this, I was communicating with Marty, and Marty sends me a picture from an old brochure, and the picture is Nolan Bushnell looking like super young, and next to him is that image of Color Gotcha. So I think he actually published it before I did. But if you search for Color Gotcha, it didn't come up. So anyway, if you search now, you'll find my blog entry. You could see this image, and you can also see a video of the game running. I hooked it up to a Robotron machine. So anyway, that's the story of fixing Color Gotcha, and that's pretty much it for me today. I want to end with kind of one last thing, and that is this statement for anyone who's worked in the game business that making games is hard. It's really, really hard. It was hard in the old days, when we were working on it. When I was a kid, I mean, you got to imagine at a time when there's no internet, there's no way to really connect with other people. There's no way to see source code. We were pretty much just making it up as we went along. We were lucky if we had a few books, a few manuals, and a few magazines. And those were the tools that we used to make the games. And once you made a game, what would you do with it? How would you get it out? You couldn't put it on Steam. You couldn't put it on the App Store on Apple. And what I think is interesting is today, it's even harder to make games. It's not like, and it's almost harder for the opposite reasons. Like, now there's awesome tools out there. There's incredible resources on the internet. I'm always reminding myself just to Google stuff, because I can find the answers to almost every question if I Google things, and it's all out there. But because it's all out there, and there's easy distribution, global distribution, because it's all out there, so many people are making games now, and so the standard is so hard, and so now you have to compete against, incredible teams all over the world. Let's say you want to make an RPG, right? You have to compete against these crazy guys in Poland called CD Projekt Red, who were RPG fans and decided maybe we can make our own, and they made Witcher 1 and it wasn't that good, and then they worked even harder and they made Witcher 2 and it was better, and then they worked even harder and they made Witcher 3 and it was world class. It was awesome. Yeah. It reminds me how lucky those of us who work in the game business are. I mean, we get to spend our time creating these little machines of joy. That's how I think of it. And if we do that job really well, we get to see that joy, reflected back at us from the faces of the people who are playing our creations. And I don't know, for me that makes it all worthwhile. Thank you.
Are you willing to take a question or two?
Yeah, I'll take questions.
Maybe two questions. All right, I see 1 and 2 here.
Okay, there's one in the back here too. Maybe we'll try to get 3 if we can. Yeah, go ahead.
What is your absolute desert island video game?
Yeah, I put it in the talk. It's really Mule. Mule is my favorite game of all time, so that's a quick one I can answer. All right.
Mine is quick too. Were you responsible for the Easter eggs in Excel that are games?
So the question was about Easter eggs in Excel. Every version of Excel from the very beginning had an Easter egg. I actually just put out a story on my blog about the first arcade Easter egg, which you should go read if you haven't seen it. The very first one found so far is from Starship 1. And I just put this story out a couple weeks ago. It's really, really a fun story, so you should read that. As far as Excel goes, they were already working on Easter eggs when I got there. They worked on Easter eggs after I left. Some of the ones that people know best happened after I left. They did a Doom clone in Excel. They did a flight simulator in Excel. But one of the Easter eggs that's less well known, when I was the lead programmer, I actually had a dream. And in my dream, there was a box of Lotus 123, which was our main competitor. And the box started shaking, and then it exploded in bugs, and bugs crawled all over it. And so that's actually one of the Easter eggs in one of the versions of Excel. So I think that's Excel 3.3. Yeah.
I was just wondering, in terms of preserving history, do you think it's going to be harder to preserve the hardwired games, the older games that were set when they came out, versus the games today that seem to require constant updating and or servers to preserve the experience that people have today?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of people now trying to focus on this idea of preservation. The Strong Museum is one, for example. There's a group called MADE down in California, but none of them are really that far along yet, I think. The MADE guys are bringing a game called Habitat back to life, which was one of the first online multiplayer games. So there are some people focused on the online side of things, but I think you're right. I mean, I'm sure many mobile games are just being lost right now. They have an online component that will never run again. That game business is so brutal. Games get launched and they can tell within the first week whether the game's going to make money or not. And so they'll work on a game for 2 years, they'll launch it, and the first week they'll pull the plug and it'll be gone and they'll never be seen again. But I think that situation's particularly bad in the Bronze Age arcade space, and that's why I care about that space. In fact, the news story that I'm working on is about Grand Track 10, which is so many firsts. It's the first racing game, first true car racing game. It's the first game with a ROM. I think it's the first game with an interlaced display. It's the first game with a security chip in it. Anyway. The reason I have that game is because a buddy of mine who's an arcade collector, he had to get rid of his warehouse of games, and nobody wanted any of the black and white ones. So when he contacted me, he said, "Ed, it's either you or the dumpster." And I'm like, "Bring them on over," And that's, unfortunately, if you look at the prices, a good 82 game will sell for $1,000 plus these days, but if you go to a super rare 1974 game. I don't know. I bought a anti-aircraft off our local Craigslist, 1975, because I had been watching it on Craigslist go down and down and down. And when it got down to $150, I'm like, I have to buy this, or it's gonna be thrown in the dumpster, So right now, I care more about preserving the stuff that's going to go away. And also, I'm starting to do, and Marty's done a ton of this, interviewing the people who are involved in making the games. So in my story that's coming up about fixing Grand Track 10, I interview Larry Emmons, I interview Ron Milner, and I interview Steve Meyer. In fact, it's the interview of Ron Milner which is how I found out about the Easter egg in Starship One, which no one knew about until I published this 2 weeks ago. So anyway, thank you for the question. Thank you guys. I'll be in the back if anybody wants to ask me any more questions. Appreciate it.
And freeze, everyone.
And that's it. That's the end of this podcast episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, learning about how Ed Freeze contributed all the things that he did, including being part of the team that led to the development of the original Xbox gaming console. And I hope you remember to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the channel out immensely. And until next time, take care, stay safe, and game on.